Good afternoon, everybody. I see still some people coming in. Very welcome to all of you to the session on European experience with new mobility impacts. As we can easily start, I would say, I can start with some housekeeping. Sorry for those of you who have already seen it for the fourth time, but I'll promise to keep it brief. And after the housekeeping, I will give you an introduction of the speakers and this session and the content of the session. So let's start with some housekeeping. Most importantly, you can see at the right, you have some different options. I hope all of you by now have experienced it and practice with it. It's interesting at least to look at the people who are in the session. And after the session, you can use networking options and send direct messages to the people that you want to relate to and discuss with. And most importantly for this session, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we're hopefully also going to use a poll. So this is it for now for the housekeeping, and I would like to officially start this session. Let me introduce myself. My name is Diana Vonk Noordegraaf. I work at TNO, which is an independent research institute in the Netherlands, and we are looking into innovations. Personally, I work in the field of traffic and transport, so working on the mobility system, and we look about how to scale up those innovations. We do that with applied scientific research, not only in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, and we would very much work to like internationally. I must say that the session of this title is, well, it is accurate, but it's not complete, I would say. Because on top of European perspective, we also have one of our speakers is Becky, who is from the US, and she will add the American perspective. So I would like to present to you to our esteemed panelists one by one, and then present you with the schedule for today. So let's introduce our panelists to you. We start off with Becky Steckler. She is the program director of the Urbanism Next Center of the University of Oregon. And as you could hear in the plenary yesterday, she's one of the initiators of the Urbanism Next conferences in the US. She's also one of our members of the organizing committee and the program committee today. And she's doing a lot of research on the impacts of emerging technologies and particularly focusing on AVs, the sharing economy, and e-commerce. It's very nice that she can bring in some international perspective to this discussion too. Of course, we're also going to share some insights on new mobility impacts in Europe. And we do that with Claus, who is a senior researcher and project manager at Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovations Research. And Claus is focusing on both the mobility and the energy system, which is increasingly becoming more intertwined, I would say. And he's working on impact assessment and strategy development there. Our third speaker of today is Niels van Oort, who is a co-director of the Smart Public Transport Lab and also is assistant professor of the public transport at Delft University of Technology. And he focuses on public transport planning, dealing with the passenger perspective, which I think is very relevant, and also looking in issues of reliability and data. And after that, we have given you 3 presentations on the impacts of new mobility. Sander van Lingen of Dell Technologies will reflect on those presentations. And Sander is working on business development, but I like his own title better, who says, I'm a digital innovation accelerator, which I think suits him very well because he looks at how can we make our cities digital. And Sander works across the globe for all different types of organizations and partners that cooperate with Dell. And he also cooperates with TNO on the topic of smart cities. Welcome all of you, and welcome our esteemed panelists to this session. I'm going to show you the schedule that we have for today. After my brief introduction, we have 3 presentations and then a reflection by Sander, and then we do a discussion and a wrap-up. So let me take a few more minutes before we start off with the presentations to give you a brief introduction in the topic. Well, the idea that we wanted to share is that we'd like to share some insights so that you learn about a wide range of transportation impacts, and not only about transportation, but also about the environmental impacts, the impacts on urban design, because we really feel that new mobility issues touch upon all those different topics. Furthermore, we share with you how you get to those impacts, so innovations in impact assessments and models that are used to create those insights. But maybe even more importantly, we'd like to explore the future options for research and also the actions that are needed to further understand and also manage the impacts of new mobility concepts. I hope that you will very much enjoy this session. So you're here because you're interested in new mobility impacts, obviously. So to give you an idea about what is new mobility, well, for us, it's about all the new services and concepts, both in passenger transport and in e-commerce and logistics. It's a range from mobility as a service to automated vehicles, shuttles and pods, new types of public transport. So it's a wide range of new mobility concepts that we're actually looking into today. And when we are discussing about impacts, the way that we look at it from our research institute TNO is that we always look at it from an adaptive approach. So understanding the impact is about the entire learning cycle from plan, do, check, and act. And I'll give you some examples. So in the planning phase, we are often applying interactive urban design planning processes that do an integration not only from a mobility perspective, but also spatial planning and energy issues, and that in an integral way. And then if you look at what is it actually that we do in the field of new mobility, well, that can be about all types of new services, often driven by new technologies. So that's the picture on the top right. We look at what are the emerging technologies that are out there and how are they going to affect the impacts that we would like to have in practice. Of course, you like to understand and learn more about the impact, so we also try to check that with all kinds of tools and models to ex ante, ex durante, and ex post evaluate what are the impacts of new mobility concepts on the entire system, so from a systems perspective. And after that, once you have learned about the impacts, you want to continue the cycle with adjusting, being nimble, being flexible and adaptive. Yesterday, we have already learned a lot about that as well. And in the left corner at the lower level, you see the governance framework that we have developed, which is all about what are the different ingredients that you need to start acting and to be adaptive and to close that learning cycle. And then we do it all over again. So this is just a brief introduction about new mobility and new mobility impacts. And I would very much like to invite Becky to give the first presentation. So please, Becky, come on up the stage. Thank you, and share your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. For me, it's early in the morning, and everyone has been very understanding. I was up at about 3:30 this morning to get ready to join everyone in Europe. So I'm on the Pacific West Coast of the United States, and yes, and so I am the program director at the Urbanism Next Center, and I've been here since 2017, and it's been a really fascinating time for me and work that I get to do. And so basically, at the Urbanism Next Center, we study how our digital devices, our smartphones and our computers, are changing the way that people and goods move. And so we're not really studying the technology itself so much as, what are some of these, kind of first order impacts. So when Uber or Lyft or e-scooters, bike share, when they are introduced or used within a community, what happens with shifts in mode or congestion, the total, for us, vehicle miles traveled, things like that. And really what we want to understand are what are the implications of some of these changes for things like land use and urban design, building design, transportation, of course, and also, but real estate markets. How are developers thinking about this? And ultimately, what we want to understand are what are the implications also for equity and equitable outcomes? What about health and safety? Are these new emerging technologies making our communities safer or not? What about the environment, especially greenhouse gas emissions or pollution, air pollution, or the economy and jobs? Is it supportive of local jobs or not? And the kinds of questions we're really trying to answer is also what should we be doing about it? What are the policies that governments should be adopting, or the programs, or even the subsidies that can help to really achieve and create the communities we all want to live in? How do we need to talk to people, our residents, as well as decision makers, elected officials, about what these changes are? What are the different trade-offs? How do we design our cities? How do we change that design? And ultimately, I'm at a research institution, so I want to know, what am I supposed to be studying about all this? So that's really kind of what the Urbanism Next framework, what we've been working on at the University of Oregon, and working with a lot of others, both in the US as well as around the world, which has been really great. And so about 2 years ago, one of the things we really wanted to understand in an area that I focus on is on policies. So as these new technologies come in, how are governments responding, and how can we really shape deployment? And so one of the things we wanted to do was actually look at, we looked at about 220 pilot projects from both primarily in the United States, but also up in Canada. And this was everything from the movement of people. So we were looking at, micromobility, as well as transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, partnerships with other organizations, which often was transit, but sometimes local governments, even some nonprofits like food banks that were trying to get people to and from food bank locations. And then we also looked at microtransit and also autonomous vehicle, mostly testing, honestly, but some kind of things that I would say would come right into the actual pilot projects. We also looked at autonomous vehicle at urban delivery. So looked at a little bit at goods movement and some of the pilot projects that were happening there. So we could really understand, because I'm actually going to talk a little bit more in depth about a specific project that we are working on that's funded by the Knight Foundation, but it's an autonomous vehicle initiative. And basically, the Knight Foundation is working with we are working with 4 communities across the United States: San Jose, which is in California on the West Coast, Detroit, Michigan, which is where so much of the auto manufacturing in the United States happens, and definitely headquarters. The city of Pittsburgh, where Carnegie Mellon University is, and they have an amazing robotics teams. There's a lot of, I would say, human capital that autonomous vehicle companies are really taking advantage of. And then Miami-Dade County, which is in southern Florida, and they have some great weather and very open policies to be able to test. So definitely 4 communities in the United States where there's a lot of testing going on. And Knight has been talking to these communities and really wanted to work with, understanding how we can engage residents, so we can understand really what are their needs. And this is something that I know that we're very interested in as well, because so much of the technology, when it's first introduced, is understandably introduced in places where those companies are going to find, the greatest concentration of customers and kind of destinations, places where either people or goods need to come from and to. So they're looking for high density locations, often with a lot of people that have higher incomes, higher educations. And the question I often ask is, are we just providing more transportation options to people that are already transportation rich? How do we take care of the people that are harder to serve. And so this project really is trying to dive a little bit deeper into that. How do you help seniors that don't live right in downtown? Can we go a little bit farther out? Can we satisfy some of those other needs? We also wanted to find a partner that would really work with us on the private sector side. And so we're actually, because of COVID, when we first started the project in 2018, we assumed that we would be working primarily on passenger autonomous vehicles. With the COVID pandemic starting last year, we had to pivot to urban delivery. And so we're working with a company called KiwiBot. And then finally, most of our recommendations are for local government. What are the tools and levers that they can potentially use to get companies to kind of maybe go out of their comfort zone and to really provide additional services. And so and the way that we're thinking about this is there's a very strong equity component and also discussion with the community itself. So we're definitely very focused on kind of that public engagement, talking to people, understanding both their perceptions, what are the barriers for use. And so, is English not your first language? And so there are, potentially language barriers, or even a lot of people in the US might have a smartphone, but they might not have a data plan, or be just nervous about going over their data plan, or also nervous about identity theft, risks that might be an inconvenience for me, but has real financial implications for somebody who's living a little closer to the edge. So really kind of diving into those very specific equity issues and looking for ways to overcome those. And at the same time, autonomous vehicles are being tested in some communities, but they're not widespread. And so local governments are really trying to dive into how should we be, how should we be receiving these things, and really thinking about those tools and levers. What is of value to a private company that governments can provide, so that at the same time they can negotiate and say, well, we want you to serve this other population that might not be on your radar. How can we do a little bit of push and pull to get the things that we really want and to develop the communities that we want to live in? And so there's just a few things I wanted to touch on. And that is, don't wait for the autonomous vehicle technology to show up. And this is really a lesson that I would say, and again, I'm talking mostly about autonomous vehicles, but really it's for any kind of new emerging mobility. By the time that technology shows up in your city, or that new mode, it's sometimes really too late, or it's really difficult to go back in after the technology is there. So definitely now is the time to plan for it, and to make sure that your city is prepared to answer the questions that they really need to answer to get the kind of deployment that they want. In the US, it's been huge to really think about, how do you really nurture the relationships you need to, primarily with your residents. And so many residents, especially lower income or people of color, are very distrustful of government. Either promises have been made that haven't been delivered, or there's just no promises at all, and the focus of most investment is maybe in other places around the city. And so not only that, but pilot projects are experiments in themselves. And if you are a lower income person, then you might not want to be experimented on, because if your vehicle doesn't show up, and that means that you don't get to work on time, and being on work on time is really important, you might get fired, then you don't want to be in the part of that experiment. And so it's been a really good process, I think, for the cities that we're working with in Miami-Dade County to really think through, how do you build some of this trust back? How do you really describe that? Also finding great partners. And I have to say, it's been fascinating to work with KiwiBot, which is an urban delivery startup. It's like a little cooler on wheels, and they're working fast all the time, and have been really willing to work with the communities as part of this project. And I think they're just as fascinated by what the city see is valuable, as well as what the the cities have it's been really interesting, I think, for them to see that. So I've seen a lot of different technology companies, and some are willing to work and some aren't, but it is really worth it to find those partners that are willing to come, halfway or sometimes more than halfway to meet you where you are. The COVID-19 pandemic really, it's probably took us about 6 to 9 months to really determine, what do we need to do from here? Where do we need to go? And often government is not known for being nimble or being able to pivot very quickly. And so, for so many of these activities, and especially as governments are figuring out just what the technology means in their community and then working through how to respond and experimenting with some different responses, I think it's just going to take us a while to really come up with a strategy that works. And so, it's definitely an outlook that needs to be fostered to say, yeah, we might try something and it might fail, but actually that's a win because we're learning throughout this process. So, being open to learning as well as then being able to pivot and be nimble, I think is going to be a good skill to have in the future. And finally, I'm actually really surprised at some of the things that we've been learning. So for example, early in the process, Mercedes-Benz was doing a small pilot in the city of San Jose, and they were just going from a route from a transit station to the Mercedes-Benz distribution or like office. And so it was a regular route. They would go back and forth and back and forth. And one of the things that they ended up recording were patterns of behavior outside of the vehicle. And one of those was a location that was roughly mid-block, where they're seeing a lot of pedestrians that were just jumping across the street in a place where there wasn't a safe crosswalk. And so the city determined that that's actually there's a need. People want to go across there, so why don't we think about investing in infrastructure and making it much safer? So I think being able to see those patterns outside is something that they weren't expecting to come out of it, but they looking for opportunities to make the environment safer was really valuable to them, and they were surprised by that. KiwiBot also is offering their cities the ability to map the sidewalk, everything from measuring, the width of the sidewalk, the slope. Is there a curb cut so that it's easy for wheeled vehicles, whether it's a wheelchair or not, to go up? Is there, other things that are on the sides of the sidewalk? And that's something that most cities in the United States don't have, they haven't mapped their sidewalk infrastructure. And so they're really looking forward to that. And so those are just a few things that I wanted to share. I'm excited to answer questions later on, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Becky, for sharing all of this information with us, and also for getting up so early. It's much appreciated. Maybe one brief question for now, and then we can dive into it a bit more in the discussion later on. But I know that you've looked into many, many pilots and projects. On top of what you presented, what's your personal favorite?
I'm going to be talking in a lot more detail about some of the recommendations from a report that we did. And one of the ones that I actually kind of walk through is just from my hometown, Portland, Oregon. And they have conducted 2 pilot projects, and they are in the process of actually doing, adopting kind of deployment recommendations that are going to last probably for a longer period of time. And just tracking kind of through that process has been really fascinating. And then the other thing I would say too is we have the San Francisco, the city of San Francisco is also going to present on that panel, and they've done some really great things with micromobility as well. So those are a couple, but each of them, I'm kind of surprised at the things that I've learned from looking at a wide variety of pilot projects.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like now to invite Claus to the floor so he can give his presentation. Claus.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you for joining, Claus. Can you share your presentation, please?
Yes.
Great.
So give me a second. It's probably that one here. I hope that is.
Claus is going to share with us the public responses on new mobility, so I really look forward to it. And Claus, could you please enter the stage again? Claus, when sharing the presentation, I think you, there you are again.
It doesn't really.
Okay.
Okay. Let me get one more. Is it there?
No, I don't see it yet.
Okay. Because the thing doesn't let me. Maybe we change the order of speakers to not to wrap up too much time. Because I'm pressing on the knob here for sharing, and nothing is happening. So sorry, I'm really not very good in these things.
Or I can try to share your presentation if you like.
Okay.
Just give me a minute.
Really a bit concerned that this is not working here.
Okay. I have your presentation. Let me share it for you. And then please indicate when I have to go to the next slide so I can help you out.
Okay, that is really super. Because I don't know what happened here. We had problems with that connection before. So just next slide. If you just move forward, it's the same one. Well, entitled my presentation, Sharing, Hailing, Selling, what can new mobility services offer? So if you just click these pictures around along, we see a lot of transportation modes that are coming up and partly are disappearing again. We have the story with O-bikes and mo-bikes that I learned yesterday in the Netherlands too. And I want to focus on a very specific point in my presentation, and that is user behavior. What are people using these modes for, and why? So we have different things, different items we can share. For example, if we start with the product sharing, we know that since quite a while, car sharing is in the market since the early 1990s. We have bike sharing. Then we can also share services, which is ride-hailing, ride-sharing. We have here some companies that are more on the European market. In urban transport and interurban transport, like BlaBlaCar, if you click forward. And then we have the connecting facility. So digital intermodal platforms that make our life with these different options that overwhelm some people indeed much easier if people are familiar with these digital modes. But what do they actually do? If they're user-oriented, if they are, say, easy to access, they really can contribute to bring down transaction costs of mobility. So you can use different options whenever you want them, whenever you need them. You can also only use one mode as used before. So this is the same effect that we can observe in other periods of life or in other circumstances, which is, for example, teleshopping with Amazon or things like that. These markets are growing quickly. If you put the next slide on, which is mapped here. The number of customers from Uber, together with say the number of vehicles on the road with station-based car sharing modes in Germany, which is the yellow line, and free-floating car sharing services. So these two are merging somehow at the moment. So you have mixed forms of one-way options and station-based car sharing, which is then pretty similar to the free-floating one. But you see, the free-floating car sharing services is just developing as dynamically and as quickly as the ride-pooling services or the ride-hailing services by Uber do. Next slide, please. So then we have started in a regional project in Germany, a poll in 2 waves, which was representative among German cities above 100,000 inhabitants. This took place in 2 waves. The first and main wave of this survey was before the COVID crisis, so in 2019. Altogether, we had about 3,060 valid responses to the survey. And our main goal with that was to understand or to get an idea of how people use or use now and intend to use the several new, well, not all of them are very new, the several, say, shared mobility services. And what we see here, and that's also what we see in the statistics, we are still talking about a market niche. So this is the very right bars, end of the bars here in light yellow, that say, well, those modes that are on the market or since 20 or 25 years now, like car sharing, we have about a 4% market share or usage share. The same for ride hailing, and what we observed is many people put taxi use into that, and that's really not a new one. All the other things that are relatively new and that demand usage of mobile apps or whatever, like bike sharing, e-motorcycle sharing, e-scooter sharing, well, they are still at a very much lower market share today. So, and there are many people, well, we are living in a bubble kind of, because we are researching that, but there's over 50% of people, or around 50% of people that have never heard something of e-scooter sharing. We didn't really believe that, but that's the result of the poll. Next slide. So, then we asked people on their intention to use these new mobility services. And the result was, well, more than half, and well above 50% of people said, well, that's not for me, I will never use it, or rather not. Well, there's still a significant part of people saying, yes, I may use that, or I have used it before. But a significant part of people are not really intending to use these. And this is in particular the case for e-scooter sharing, although we see streets getting full of these vehicles. Next slide, please. We have asked people about their the travel purpose they may use these services for. We have selected here again the 4 main new modes of transport, always in 2 variants. For example, if we take the upper left one, say bike sharing with conventional bikes and e-bikes, where we see, okay, this is something obviously for private trips, for shopping a little bit, but mainly for leisure trips in the daytime. while if we go down, say, or if you, well, more to the right side here with the scooter sharing, we see that is something definitely for leisure. This is the one down here in night times. So we can segment a little bit the market of travel purposes according to these new modes of transport. It is only well, I've just summarized that here. Thank you. So it's only the no, just one back, please. Yeah, this one. Thank you. There are some not always clear preferences, so there's a copy and paste error where, say, in the lower right one, the car sharing one should be that's the one where we have the least clear preferences for any travel purposes. But all the other modes, the micro sharing and the ride pooling, they have dedicated areas of use. Next slide, please. Then. Thank you. So what we also observed is there is a discrepancy between what people, what's the attitude of people towards certain means of transportation among these new mobility services and the actual environmental impact. I used a pretty easy set of slides here. In the right figures, we see, say, people's perception towards these new modes, where we see, well, this is pretty neutral in car sharing, bike sharing, ride pooling, and relatively negative in scooter sharing. On the right side, we just looked at the energy consumption of these modes. How far can you get, say, with 1 kilowatt hour? And that is impressively 100 kilometers with an 0.5 kilowatt hour battery with a scooter, and only 2 kilometers with a car, for example, which is obviously used for car sharing, ride pooling. So there's a kind of a mismatch in perception, and of course it depends on how you use these things and which kind of modal split effects are created and which kind of additional traffic, so induced traffic, are created by these modes. Next slide, please. And so we asked ourselves in discussion with urban decision makers, with transport companies, how can you improve the environmental or the sustainability of these new transportation modes? And well, we just picked out some here for ride pooling. This is we're anyway here at the edge of defining public transport or transit in a new way now. So public transport has to get more flexible in order to meet the demand of people. And if you use ride pooling services as a flexible edge or arm, so to say, of public transport, that seems to work pretty good in pilots and in applications, at least here in Germany. Car sharing, well, we saw the figures. Free floating car sharing had the highest growth rate, much higher than station-based car sharing. But station-based car sharing is more likely to replace privately owned passenger cars. E-scooters and bike sharing. There we need to combine models. We need to link them to public transport and transit. Work with concessions and with pricing models. So there is still much to learn and much to research. I think that's the area where we know least. So, and I think I'm through. And thank you. That's my colleagues who work with me on that. Deborah.
Okay, Dr. Claus, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I invite the people in the session to ask questions to our speakers so that we can pick up in the discussion. But for now, Claus, what do you think that needs to be done in terms of regulation?
regulation is really the key to the sustainability, and I've pointed out a number of options. So say private or unregulated use of ride pooling services. Well, we see that in US cities and maybe in some Asian cities really creates a lot of additional traffic and puts pressure on public transport. So here we recommend to integrate that in public transport services, in particularly in rural areas. So in there you need to give a reward to ride pooling companies to serve areas and times of lower demand, to support public transport and to increase the mobility options for everybody. But the most important thing for cities, for regions, and even for countries is to create a vision where they want to go, which kind of environment they want to have and want to create. So where does the cities want to develop to? So making this kind of vision in a possibly interdisciplinary and participative process, I think is the very first step to make decisions towards these goals.
Thank you very much for now, and hope to see you back in the discussion. I will please invite Niels for his presentation. Niels, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diana. Let's see if it's going to work. There we go. Do you see me smiling in my pre-COVID look? Diana, are we good? Don't hear you, so I assume things work. It's always tricky, but thanks for inviting me and having me here in this great session about emerging modes. My name is Niels van Oort. I'm a co-director of the Smart Public Transport Lab, and that's clear that I'm involved in public transport research, but as we discussed today, let me see. How to continue? Yes, there we go. I think current times are very, very interesting because of all the technology development and accordingly all these new modes appearing and also disappearing and vanishing again. What is the value of all these new modes? How could they help us to achieve our goals? Even incorporating the pandemic impacts, I think the timing is right now, because I think what we learned from this pandemic, at least, is that this is the moment to rethink mobility, to rethink public transport. Also, given our new opportunities to work from home, new patterns, maybe let's wait and see. So this is a good moment, I think, to rethink mobility, to rethink public transport, including these emerging modes. And that's actually what we do also in our research group, where we try to find what are the impacts of all these modes to society. And I think Claus stated it very well in his presentation. It's about the cities and the authorities themselves. What do you like to be, or society actually? What kind of city or region do you want to become? What are your major goals? And to get some insights in that, we developed this 5E model, which is quite similar according to some aspects as the Urbanism Next framework presented by Becky. And also very happy to see that framework, and also a lot of presentations about these wider impacts and potential benefits of mobility, public transport, emerging modes. Because in my opinion, we tend to focus in our tools, in our assessment frameworks, mainly on mobility impacts like travel time, accessibility and that kind of things. And of course that's important, but I think there's much more to take into the equation. It's about efficient cities, so space usage, quality of life. It's about the economy, it's about the environment and health, which I think will be on the agenda, not only due to COVID, but also due to weight increase and diseases related to that. So an active modes could of course help there. And last but not least, also mentioned by Becky happily, is equity, social inclusion, providing opportunities for people to get access to schools, to jobs, for everybody in society. And actually, this model is what we try to use when we are assessing the impacts of emerging modes, also the impacts of public transport in general. And happy to discuss that that here with all of you. A few pointers I would like to give for the discussion later on about flexible transport. I could talk for hours about all emerging modes, but let's focus a bit here. Demand responsive transit. There are multiple forms, you could say, on this type of mode. First of all, if we talk about public transport, we talk about shared, but we also see, of course, some single-use systems. We could focus on the city, urban systems versus rural, also mentioned by Becky, which is a major difference. Also, given the directions, what I see, maybe as a starter of a follow-up discussion, is that many authorities think that these systems will solve problems in rural areas, while if you ask commercial companies, they will probably go to the places where people are, and then they probably tend to focus on urban dense areas. So there are multiple formats, but I try to go along. But first of all, I would like to say that it's actually not new. It's over 100 years ago that we started with this on-demand transport. So you don't have a fixed schedule, you don't have per se a fixed route. It's more customer focused, you could say, and that is not like it is invented yesterday. But again, it's already there for a long time. However, it's obvious that due to technology developments, I think currently, starting in the 80s, 90s, but especially if you look nowadays about the technology of our computers, the algorithms, the computer power, actually to calculate smart allocations of vehicles, to optimize fleet, etc. That's obvious a thing what many TNCs do right now on the one hand, and on the other hand, also customer interfaces with smartphones. If you think about 15 years ago, it's not so long ago actually that we started with these smartphones, but it's unthinkable actually that we don't have them here. And of course, they are very helpful in using DRTs and make it a bit comfortable for our clients. So already mentioned, we have on-demand transport, TNCs, individually focused, but I think thinking about 5 E's, the impacts, if you really want to make a societal value there, and by the way, it's not up to us as researchers to make decisions on what the societal goals should be. It's up to us to show the impacts and help, hopefully, and support authorities to make the right choices and at least know what the consequences are of specific choices. But I think personally, if you want to go for space efficient cities, then sharing should be somewhere in the equation. And if we look at sharing from a supply side perspective, a great research here shown by from New York City, colleagues from MIT. If you look at those dense cities, then you see that above 95% of the taxi trips could be made in a shared way without losing too many additional time. Again, this is of course in a dense city. You can imagine that in rural areas, it's completely different. A study we did ourselves in our lab showed for the city of Amsterdam that if people are willing to use these systems and willing to share, you could actually replace 9 cars by 1 on-demand vehicle. So the potential, I think, is obvious there. But what I missed, especially last years in the discussions also about mobility as a service, is the willingness to share. Do people really want to share a trip with a stranger? And I think we should be honest there. If we look at the popularity of cars versus public transport, there are many factors, of course, involved. But I think one of them is also that you, in a car, you have your private space with your own trash, your own music, etc., etc. So let's not overestimate the willingness to share, but let's try to be realistic, and that's what we try to bring on the table as researchers. This is research by Maria Alonso Gonzales. She did a PhD on the topic. She will be presenting tomorrow morning in a session where she will discuss much more about this. But this results here is a latent class analysis about the willingness to share by multiple people. And you see actually 4 groups here of the Dutch urban society showing that about half of this group is willing to share a trip. So that's good news. And it's a little bit depending whether you're an optimist or a pessimist maybe, but that means that the other half is not willing to share. And that's not per se good or bad news, I would say, but that I think that's relevant to take into account when we are trying to unlock the value of these systems. If we look at practice, we like to do a lot of theoretical research in our lab, but we also like to be involved in pilots to learning by doing. It's also very interesting these days, especially if we all can go out again and use the systems, to learn from pilots and tests. And these are two articles of a Dutch professional transport magazine. And the left one was in 2017 saying, or showing actually, that the DRT system in the east of the Netherlands, Brainflex, won the Happy Customer Prize, if I translate it directly. So there was a lot of positive attention also from the passengers and a lot of appreciation. However, 2 years later, and that's the right picture, in the same magazine, we saw the news that this system stopped to exist because of financial challenges. And that's a little bit about the story, I think, of DRT. The potential is there, but still we are looking for the formula, how to make this a big success. And also here you see work of Graham Curry and others looking at this from a more worldwide perspective. You see many systems worldwide, and you can also see the statistics here, how many of these systems are still active after starting. You see in red the ones that actually stopped working after a couple of years. And you can also see that in Europe we still have quite a relatively high level of active systems, but for the other continents it's a little bit lower. And still, I think it's clear that there are challenges here to actually implement and maintain and operate these systems. So something is happening there, and if we really want to continue with this, we need to find out how to manage this. Another example from the Netherlands, in a rural area near Amsterdam, I should say, it's Malcolm Flex, first generation. Nowadays there's a second generation, so that's totally different than this, just to be sure. Was introduced, and what happened is that a fixed bus service was replaced by an on-demand one. There's much more details in the paper later, but that will do it for now. And what you see here is a ridership before and after. You can ignore the blue line, look at the orange line. The previous one, the dotted one, was the ridership before with the fixed lines, and then afterwards you see a substantial drop of ridership due to the implementation and the start of operation of this on-demand system. However, what you also see in this table, if you look at the lowest part, you see that the needed vehicle kilometers to transport a passenger almost halved. So the efficiency of the system increased. And then, of course, the question is there, was this a success or not? And I actually asked this at a Dutch conference at some time, and it was a little bit of a 50-50 whether people consider this a success, because that's of course depending on your goals. Some people said it's a success because efficiency increased and still there was at least one form of accessibility. The others say that some people couldn't use the system anymore, couldn't make their trips they actually wanted to make, which has obviously impacts on equity. And I think model shift was also mentioned before, is actually one of the key indicators, not per se ridership, but more who are actually using and what did they do before. Are they shifting from car to public transport? Are they shifting from bicycles, very popular in our country, towards an on-demand system? And that all has multiple and different impacts on all your societal impacts, I would say. So it's not that easy to consider, to say whether something is a success or not. I'm going to finalize with a few slides about the future. Becky talked about automation, and that's obvious the one we should also discuss in line with on-demand transport, because then actually you could get rid of the driver and hopefully you can increase the business case and maybe overcome the financial issues we see nowadays. But also here it's important to check, what does the passenger want? What is the passenger perception and willingness to use? In this case, we asked people in the Netherlands. In this case, it was a system as a first and last mile towards the station. I think automation, the first implementation of automation in our country at least, will probably be there. And you see here the willingness or the model shift, the expected model shift, if people are forced to use emerging modes like shared bikes, shared step scooters, etc. Of course, if you've been in the Netherlands, if you've been to this station in Delft, you know that actually most people prefer their own bike. But imagine they are forced to focus for one or the other emerging mode. You see that there is a clear potential for autonomous vehicles, both individual and shared. But it's also safe to say that even here the shared bike is much more popular. Talking about implementation of these shuttles, I think that's a nice one also for the discussion. We see a lot of pilots already started in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam actually, 20 years ago, still running in the east of the city, a great first last mile solution. But actually afterwards didn't happen much. And nowadays we have lots and lots of pilots in Europe, also in the whole world, I would say. But the major challenge is how can we scale up? How can we actually make the step from a pilot to a real life implementation? And I think there are many challenges to overcome. That's all food for thought. If you don't have much to do later this day, you can always read more if you like. Slides will be available on my website if you like. And of course, the whole research lab says hi to you. Keep in touch and happy to discuss anything with you here.
Thank you very much, Niels, for this interesting presentation. If you would like to give the audience one key message on what to do next, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it's maybe a bit boring answer here. Sorry for that, but I think what the thing is to do is, what are your real goals? What are you really looking for? What do you want to be? It's in line with Claus. And what my experience is, these goals are in general not very clear. Or we would like to achieve everything, and we would like to facilitate all modes. We would like to be inclusive. Would like etc. etc. That's not per se possible. So first think about what are our priorities, what are our main goals, and then you can start to think about what kind of mobility system would I need for it. So don't start, actually, I'm a transport engineer, but don't start with transport. Start with the city, with urban planning. What do I want to be? And then I think the rest will follow. Not easy, but I think this first question is essential.
Yes, but very important indeed. I agree. I would like to invite Sander to the floor, because you have listened also to together with us to those interesting presentations. So maybe Sander, you can give us some reflections on the things that you've heard. And so what did we learn about the European experiences with new mobility impacts? Please, Sander, go ahead.
Yeah, I think so many great things, and it's hard to pick out just one or two. I think from my perspective, from a technology perspective, in the world of innovation, we constantly see a couple of things. We see a shift from centralized to decentralized. Think of the shift from mainframe to PC, from PC back to cloud, and now from cloud back to edge computing. Just to handle all the data we generate. And we also see a trend or certain repetitive steps in maturity. So what we see is we structure, we scale. So we start with small, decentralized little projects here and there. But the next step is actually to learn from it, structure it, and build a program for growth, and actually to hit those goals, just like mentioned both by Niels and Claus. And then next step would be scaling, which is something we want to scale across cities in the world. So it's decentralized again. And I believe that if we look at the presentation of Niels and Claus, it shows that there are tremendous amounts of great solutions, and we are capable to analyze the data. And as Becky mentioned, we can prove the first order impacts. So the technology is here. We do have the knowledge. So my opinion is that actually it proves that we are ready for the next maturity step. I believe that we need to come together, bring our knowledge together, structure, rethink our real goals, like the vision. What is the vision we want to set? like both Claus and Niels mentioned. We need to think cross-domain and on a higher system of systems level on how do we want to transform into zero-emission cities? How do we, or how can we embrace the impact of new mobility solutions? And how can we do this in a sustainable way? I love the example of TNO and the island of Curaçao, where they face both an academic, economic, and a sustainable or a climate challenge. But by building that vision and creating a clear roadmap together with the triple helix, so both the government, the students, so education, and the companies, and by really committing to it, they have a whole plan now on how to reach their climate goals, and by accelerating their academics, by accelerating their economic development. So I really think that's an awesome example. And just like Becky mentioned in her final slides and their steps, I think it's really about setting goals, plan now, start planning, build a program with trust and partners, as she mentioned, and look for the opportunity, because the only way to scale things up and to create something sustainable is to actually drive economic value. And as of now, being in this pandemic, I believe that we are on a critical junction where we have the opportunity to leverage government stimulus funds and bring those great solutions and innovations together in order to tackle world challenges. So I would say let's come together, get off our siloed islands, bring our knowledge together, think cross-domain. Let's rethink, redesign, and plan for the future to maximize our impact. I would say let's create a vision and let's make it happen.
Wow, Sander, thank you so much for giving this elaborate summary of all the presentations and reflecting on that and sharing on that. I would like to invite all the other speakers to join us for the discussion. And maybe, Sander, you can mute yourself because I have some sound problems. Let's see if that works better. Yeah, thank you very much. So I would like to go into the discussion with you a bit more and see, okay, we have had some interesting conclusions and directions to go for, but how do we get there? So if we, for example, take a look at the discussion on that we need an integral approach, that we need to work across the silos, interdisciplinary, like Sander already summarized from your presentations. How can we do that? How can we really adopt that integral approach? Becky, can I invite you to give your ideas on that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there's a couple different ways to think about that, and I'll use some examples. So for the Night AV project, we're working with the city of Pittsburgh, and they really wanted to find a regular way to check in both with some stakeholders that have some real serious concerns, especially the disability community, on what are the impact of some of these emerging technologies, and especially autonomous vehicles. Are you going to be safe if you've got some mobility challenges and it takes you a longer period of time to get across the street, or absolutely need access to those curb cuts. And so they've actually created stakeholder groups for the stakeholders themselves, some of the neighborhood community groups, and they basically meet with them. I believe it's like roughly once a month or once every other month to give them the opportunity to understand what the technology is about, be able to ask questions on a regular basis, and provide that feedback all throughout the process. They also have another group, which is with autonomous vehicle companies that are deploying. So they get all of those folks together and talk about, this is what the city's going through. Can you also share, what are the companies doing? One of the challenges we have in the United States is that many of the companies have been successful at preempting local governments at the state level. So basically the state legislature passes legislation that says we will allow the companies to deploy throughout the state, and local governments can't regulate it, which really makes it tough when there's, when those citizens are like, we shouldn't be just opening our arms, to these technologies. We should really be, having some influence on how they can deploy. So, like that's just kind of one example of bringing it together. The other thing that many of the departments of transportation are realizing is that, even across departments and other governmental entities, they really need to communicate like what's going on. City of San Jose is probably a great example where they've had some deployments of autonomous vehicles, and they need to talk to the police department, emergency services. How are they going to respond if something happens? They've been talking with their public transport agencies, because with rail, they actually had somebody put one of those KiwiBot robots on the train tracks, and so the train didn't hit it. They managed to remove it, but the whole discussion about how do you respond to that and being prepared for it in the future. Is the company going to respond, and what are those coordination? So really being able to identify what are the issues that we're going to have to talk about, and then let's get everybody in the same room so that we can talk about those issues and figure out how we're going to respond to them.
And Claus, what's your opinion on that? Do you agree, or do you have other ideas?
I fully agree, and would maybe extend it a little bit, because we have just concluded the German National Cycling Plan 2030, and there we have talked to a lot of communities. Some who are advanced, some who are really lagging behind in ideas for changing their mobility system. And one thing that was really obvious that struck me a little bit was that learning from the success of other cities or regions is not something that is pretty easy for the city. So transferring experiences between regions must really be supported or enforced by good material, by learning courses or whatever, by national or state governments. That is one thing. And the other thing is that is maybe a bit different between the US and Europe, and between European countries. The legislative framework we have has sometimes to be adapted to allow trials more easily. What we have at the moment is a road transportation law that comes from the 1920s, when the automobile was really something new and innovative. And now slowly we start to touch these 100-year-old rules how transport should work, and have to adapt them to new technologies, to new urban lifestyle patterns, whatever, and to new transportation services. And then it's simply a question of skill, stuff, and money. So you cannot expect from an underfinanced local government, which has difficulty to engage well-skilled transportation planners and city planners, to be very engaged in new technologies. So there are even a couple of things more that you have to touch at the same time to create an empowering environment for cities to act. So maybe just some points, maybe I didn't remember the most important one.
Yes, thank you very much for adding, Claus. Niels, I think that we all agree that the working more integral is the way forward for us cities. And I think if we would talk to people in the cities and the regions, they totally agree. Yet it is complicated in practice. What's your experience?
Always easy for us here telling others what to do that. Totally agree. However, I think Claus made a very good point about learning by others, and I think also science and research could help there, because our world is internationally anyway. I think we learn automatically, you could say. For the Dutch context or European context, it's very interesting to look at the US. It's very interesting to look at Asia. What's happening there? Do we like it or don't we like it? And could we steer it? I think that are kind of ways to help practice, not only by doing research, but also by sharing good and also sharing poor experience. And that's a thing I would like to stress. I mentioned that doing pilots is very important, but I think part of doing a pilot is that you're also open that it could fail, and that's also easy for me to say as a researcher. I know it's tricky in a political arena, but we should open up there that we could accept that pilots could fail. We should also be prepared, if we're doing a pilot, that we are already trying to have a follow-up, because I see too many pilots just for the sake of a pilot, especially in the world, in the domain of autonomous vehicles. I had a student, he wrote a great paper about help my alderman would like to have an autonomous vehicle. That was trending at some point. Every municipality wanted to have the pilot just for the sake of having it. I totally see the added value there, but I think we all agree that's also not actually really helping us altogether. So having pilots, think about what if it fails, and also think about what if it's a success. Put the money where your mouth is. If you like inclusion, for instance, which I think is a very important topic, be prepared that it comes with a price. That shouldn't be a surprise for anybody.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I just put a link in the chat of another example, some of the work that we did when we did a comparison of how mobility as a service is currently going in different parts of the world. So this is, I think, a nice example, as particularly because the people that we interviewed were very honest and open, and were also sharing all the things that were not going as well as they hoped for. So I think that is indeed very important, that we try to learn as much as we can from each other. Although context may differ very much, it's also some things you can easily translate or compare through across different countries. So yes, I think that's very important. Let's go to another topic that we have touched upon, which is actually working towards societal goals, because all of you have already said it several times. We should start with the vision. We should formulate societal goals that are important, that we want to those new mobility services to contribute to, and that should actually be the starting point of designing such a services and implementing them in such a way that they actually contribute to the societal goals. Yet again, this one is not easy. So how do we shift from putting technology and pilots first towards putting the societal goals first and trying to see the new mobility service as a means to an end? Maybe Sander, do you have some ideas on that?
Yeah, my question would definitely be, why do we start with the technology? I believe that we want to see those pilots, we want to run those pilots because we do not actually have the knowledge about the technology. I would say the technology is there. That's not the issue, that's not the problem. I think the challenge is, how do we actually organize ourselves in order to contribute to the societal goals? So coming from a technology vendor, we are often challenged to show the proof of our technology. Unfortunately, often we cannot challenge the customer, the municipality, the federal government, to actually show their way or their capability to actually scale the pilot. And I believe a lot of the pilots are, since they are not part of a clear roadmap with a clear vision, I think that's where it stops. So I really think that we should come together and learn from each other, because a lot of those pilots, as Niels also mentioned, pilots are done everywhere. We should bring that knowledge together instead of looking for another piece of evidence.
So maybe you can mute again. Yeah. Thank you. So you're actually giving a plea for more a programmatic approach, and I was curious, Claus, because you have some experience with really building such a vision when it comes to cycling for the German government. So there is a good vision, because but was that also part of a more programmatic approach?
Well, that was a huge task. So we had an advisory board of 30 institutions representing policy, say economic companies and stakeholders and science. Basically, there it was a bit more easy than with new mobility, because we didn't talk about technology. We knew that was what Sandra just was saying. All the options were on the table, so we know how to build cycling-friendly cities. This was the point with that vision, was just to have a policy document where we have goals in that can be evaluated. And that's maybe one point I want to make. If we talk about societal goals and impacts, we must evaluate all these, say, technology pilots. If it comes to mass systems and new transportation systems, I think the angle is a bit a different one, because we do a lot of, say, visioning or forecasting workshops, and people's fantasy to imagine a world that is different from ours now, just a little bit better, is really bounded. So it's limited. So, and what we see is these road tests show people what may be possible to say, improve a little bit their imagination, how the future could shape. So, and therefore, I think technology demonstrations and those visioning processes can go hand in hand. This is not a fixed order where they should happen.
Yeah, well,
that was an idea.
Yeah, you touch upon a very interesting point, which is that we're all trying to predict the future, and nobody knows which direction it's going to be. And what we end up with is very different estimations on the time path and the possible impacts that it could have. Even the sign is often not easy to predict, because again, AVs, it can be both positive and negative effects depending on how you design and implement that. But I think you touched upon the important thing that you said, is that we have sometimes very much difficulty with imagining our future, and that's personally I often if I look into studies of new mobility, I'm sometimes a bit disappointed if they're just asking people like, do you expect to use that without a proper introduction or without having them some context? Because often the answer is just simply no, because they cannot imagine the type of functions or the different uses that we'll make of. It's a bit like using the mobile phone when it was introduced and people were asked, were you going to use it? Everybody's like, no, I just make an appointment with somebody. Nobody could ever imagine. But if you go one step deeper and look at the underlying factors and patterns behind it, then you could have predicted that it might be a great innovation. So how can we better do research into those expectations of the people? Niels, do you have experiences with how you can grab the concepts of innovation and get better predictions on that?
Yeah, we do. I actually had to laugh because I also was thinking of mobile phones or of non-use when I was a student, I remember, and here we are, quite addicted actually. Yeah, I think there are multiple scientific or statistical methods to tackle a bit what you are dealing with, but still talking about stated choice, for instance, sitting in your comfortable chair and then deciding, do you want to take a crowded train or whatsoever. Yeah, we all know the downside of it. And that's also why I would like to stress pilots. One is not per se better than the other, but I think in the end, it's about the combination of things. That's the first thing. So multiple pilots, of multiple methods, I would say. I think it's enriching for us researchers, not only doing theoretical research, but also going out. Regarding what you're saying about the imagination of people, I think also here technology, although I must say that we talk about emerging modes, I would like to say that the bicycle, relatively low tech, is one of the in my view at least, the major solutions. So it's not always about high tech stuff, but in this case, I think technology could also help us with VR opportunities and trying to give a much better experience to a potential future. And to finalize, the last thing, always think in scenarios, because I think we are not very good in predicting our future. I don't know if anybody predicted this pandemic, but I'm not so sure. But what I think we are good at is if we know the scenario, we could at least assess some general directions. And if we have multiple scenarios at stake, that could at least help us a bit to get into this holy grail of predicting the future. I think that's the best we can get. And I think especially with VR and all the other technologies there could be very helpful to help us imagine and think and dream about the future. How do you want the future to be like instead of what do you think it will be like?
Diana, I would love to chime in on this too. It was interesting when we reached out to people in San Jose and asked them, like what they thought of AVs. And some folks were like, AVs, is that audio visual like you're talking about, or adult video? And they really saw it as, we were in a lower income community, and they're like, that's not ever going to be for me. That's going to be for somebody else. And so, and I spoke a little bit earlier about experimenting on people. I think what's really been impressed upon me in doing this particular project was the value of doing a low risk, just kind of touch and feel. Because like you said, it's really hard to think, I don't even know how I would use this technology because I don't really have a good sense of what it could provide for me. So being able to, bring residents, especially trusted people from a community, to downtown, maybe where the low speed shuttle or where the service is being used, and just being able to kind of check it out has been really valuable. And then actually asking them specific questions. So that's like, how could somebody who was lower income maybe use the service? But even then, the importance of following up after people have used the service to understand what would you otherwise would have done. Would you, if you hadn't had this delivery made for you, would you have walked to go get it? Would you have not made the trip at all? Would you have, driven your own personal vehicle? So like, thinking about those societal goals, especially around greenhouse gas emissions, what are we doing to the transportation system and emissions? And just being able to understand the context of why people are making the decisions that they're making. I think there's some really valuable tools to, surveys and focus groups and just, personal interviews to really understand what's happening or what could potentially happen in the future.
Yes, thank you very much for adding to this one. I would like to, with a little eye to the time, also share the results from the poll, what was actually related to the presentation of Claus. Because we all know that, the shared services and new mobility services can have both negative and positive results. But how can cities prevent the overuse of shared services, did we ask to the audience? And they shared it with us. We see a bit of a mix in answers, but most people think that it is a good idea to integrate it into public transportation services, combined with doing something with concessions and access regulations. Claus, is this what you expected?
Yeah, that's the way it needs to go. So our simulations show if you don't regulate, you may turn up in overuse or in rebound effects in modal split and obtain negative results. And what I said before, public transport is anywhere at a crossroad at the moment. So they have to innovate. Fixed routes, well, we have seen your example, I think it was from Sander before, of these flexible vehicle that's created less use. That's of course not what we want to have, but depending on how we use that, we see some regional transport examples where ride pooling services work pretty well in rural areas, for example, and support public transport. So this mix of push and pull measures, I think that's the way anyway we have to tackle transportation in most cases, and that holds true for new services as well.
Well, thank you very much. With an eye to the time, I would like to ask everybody just a very brief famous last words in this session so we can wrap up. Ladies first, Becky.
Thank you so much. I would say, it feels a little bit like a broken record, but understanding what your goals really are for projects, and especially if you're experimenting with different kind of policies or programmatic options, and thinking it all the way through, like what kind of questions do you want to answer at the end with any kind of authority? So thinking through, what's the question that you're trying to ask? How feasible is it for you to be able to answer that question? Like if you want to understand, what's the possibilities for reducing, carbon emissions, but you're only got, 2 vehicles out on the street, it's not really going to tell you exactly what it's not going to give you the volume of information that you would need to make some real definitive types of statements at the end. So, really kind of thinking through each of those steps where you're going to collect that information and, what you're personally going to need to do to be able to do that, I think is really important as well.
Yes, thank you. Niels?
Yeah, my famous last words, Diana, or at least my main message for all of us here is please team up with walking, cycling, public transport, including all these shared mobility. Let's not fight each other to make it a bit extreme, but let's team up and look for the optimal mix of these modes. And then I'm talking about operations, but also about policy and planning. Let's try to team up with them and to find the optimal mix to, in the end, achieve the societal goals we all think are the best to go for.
Nice. Sander?
Yeah, I would like to, again, about the programmatic approach. It's something we've done before. So look back at what we've accomplished in the past decades. I mean, we were capable of going to the moon, and that was done in different steps. So if we actually look at the approach there and the steps taken, I think we can learn from that in order to come together, build a vision, and take the right steps to get there.
Okay, and Claus?
Well, time is running quickly for meeting our climate targets. And no matter, we should, we have the ingredients, and there I'm with Niels, of good transportation policy at hand. And so learn from good examples, use new technologies as good as possible, evaluate the social impacts, but do something and learn from your neighbors. That would be my last word.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and maybe we can all combine those ideas, because if we can go to the moon, I'm sure we can meet the climate goals. And if we can use the VR technology, as long as we cannot meet up in person yet, I think we're able to make already the progress, maximum progress, if we join our forces throughout Europe via the network of the Urbanism Next, and hopefully also international with the International Urbanism Next network that we're building together. So I would like to have a warm thank you to all of you for joining this session, and to our amazing panelists for sharing all their ideas and presentations and discussions. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed the session.